matter of talking about fifth generation warfare or asymmetric warfare. It's just everything is war. It just happens to have a threshold that can be reached where it becomes kinetic. And when you look at it from that perspective, Russia has been very aggressively moving to do things with Europe in terms of energy. It was only when I looked into the immediate period after World War II that I became aware of all the U.S. investment, in the Atoms for Peace and Euratom programs, basically to set up nuclear power across Europe as a counterbalance, because otherwise, Europe, with the small exceptions like North Sea oil, Europe is basically what my friend Tim used to describe as a vermiform appendix just dangling off of Russia in terms of its natural resources. There's just so little there. And so from the 1960s, there were plans that the Germans undertook with the Russians to bring pipelines into Europe. And in the 70s, that started to take shape. And so Russia has been moving to basically run its energy supplies into Europe, and thereby, as many people have discussed, make Europe dependent upon them. Now they're going to have to look at the option of, such as it is, of receiving their energy from elsewhere. So that's something to think about. There are different dimensions of aggression, and because if one takes this expanded definition of warfare, then everything, economics, trade, logistical corridors, all of this is a form of war. So yeah, that. One other thing that I wanted to add was that the Arctic did not come into this discussion, and we needn't go deeply into it, but it is worth noting that with the ice cover there, it's not exactly the sea. And because of how resource rich it is, enormous amounts of energy resources, also mineral resources, and the importance of it as a trade corridor in future with the nuclear powered icebreakers and the rest, the partnership of Russia and China, with China dubbing itself a near Arctic power, and previous activities to get a piece of Greenland that China was involved in. We have to think of the Arctic or I think it's useful to think of the Arctic as a northern extension of the heartland that is not truly sea, though we see it, of course, as being sea on our maps. Just another aspect, I think, that got left out that, as I said, we don't have to go into, but it's worth thinking about in the future.
Well, very interestingly, and why did Peter the Great fund the expeditions of Bering? It was to colonize Hyperborea. It was to colonize the Arctic as if it were Australia, thinking that it would be a effective and prosperous colony. So this idea of dominating the Arctic as an extension of the Russian heartland, i.e. Hyperborea, that's the reason why Russian expansionism went the way of Alaska, effectively, by that same logic, expanding out across the Arctic. So this has been a core component of Russian thinking since Peter the Great. This isn't that isn't a novel suggestion. I think the reason that someone like Mackinder pushes back against this is the idea of its lack of the inability to navigate it effectively. But as we see with the creation of, from Russia's point of view, the modern Northern Fleet, the submarine fleet, that really isn't the case anymore. And of course, Trump may receive a lot of pushback from annexing things, desiring to annex things like Greenland. But from that point of view, there is a definite logic behind it, especially if Trump had any intention of rowing back NATO, which ultimately I don't believe he will. But regardless, another point to make, which is really pedantic, but it actually reinforces your point about everything is warfare, is to think about international law. The whole basis of our legal system is just a verbal incarnation of trial by combat. That's essentially all it is. It's just another arena from which to combat your enemies and win various battlegrounds. To answer this, because this is irritating me, in World War I, Russia basically forced Germany into a position where it had to attack because Russia had mobilized its armed forces secretly for the sake of aiding the Serbs and their aggressive posture, basically as a Slavic Piedmont in the Balkans, which was the assumption of all of the thinking of the Austrian General Staff under Herzenstorf. In World War II, the Soviet Union attacked as many countries as Germany. That's an established fact. And as we now know, the military thinking, the military posture of the Red Army during 1941 had assumed an offensive posture and not a defensive posture. It was simply a case of Germany attacking first. So, it's a Bismarckian adage, effectively, always allow for your enemy to declare war on you. In the case of Germany, they failed to do that, which is why essentially Russia gets away with that. Anyway.
One quick thing to add on that Arctic thing very, very quickly. That is a domain in which we should expect to see aggressive expansion by Russia with the participation of China. And because we think of it as empty sea, we think of it as the domain of the sea powers and not a part of the heartland, but because surface fleets are very limited in how it can be navigated, it is in some respects a land power because it's covered in ice, even though it has submarines underneath it. Also, by expanding in that direction, it is a domain of warfare that we're not going to think about politically and see in the newspapers the same way with, for example, this population or this nation or state falling under the influence of Russia. So it's not a situation where they will be aggressively expansionist or could be aggressively expansionist into populated areas, but it's extremely important because if you look at a polar projection, you will see how short the distance is between the new world and the old. Given the types of map projections we look at, we tend to miss that. But also it gives them all the bang of mineral and energy resources and new trade lanes if the climate does change, as it has been changing somewhat, and they increase their icebreaker fleet. So that's another area that is a part of the heartland that isn't truly sea or land, into which Russia can aggressively push. And I think we'll see that. I just wanted to throw that in because I wasn't sure I really made it clear with the first statement.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because what we're seeing is the rimland expanding in the north to encompass like the North Pole or at least half of it. And it is interesting that Trump, so Donald Trump, a lot of people think he's a bit of a buffoon and, he's been laughed at that he actually said that he wants to annex Canada today and Greenland. And you just think it's interesting because when people like us look at heartland theory, we can kind of see the logic in that, but for most people, it's Trump being crazy. It's Trump just being illogical and foolish, or he wants to create this giant American empire that Semyagog was alluding to earlier. But there is a kind of logic to it. It does make sense. But the thing is, we would end up, especially if you add in this kind of isolationist move in America. It's sort of like the problem is, of course, you've got a democracy and we don't know where that's going to be in 4 years. But assuming this is a sort of trend that's going to set in with America, where American power is declining, they look to consolidate in their own hemisphere and across it does make perfect sense that we're going to take as much as we can get and then hunker down in our own continent. And in that scenario, the situation for Europe is even more dire because then we are left. And I don't want to keep bringing this up, but I'm just so suspicious when people say, well, you'll be all right. All they want to do is trade, because then you're left in a position where you've alienated the heartland. You've annoyed and alienated everybody around you. And you're just this aging, sort of decrepit peninsula, disarmed. And even your sugar daddy has decided that he's going home and locking up shop into this kind of George Orwell 3 power, Orwell 2 power situation of three grand sort of civilizational states, and Europe's position in that is absolutely dire. And this is what concerns me. But yeah, there's definitely a logic to what Trump's saying, and you think when you look at some of the people who are sort of leading foreign policy, they do seem not very bright. Now, I wouldn't expect. Has Donald Trump sat down and read Heartland Theory and then sort of looked at toward the future, or because I would expect, funny enough, that somebody who was regarded as like this insane hawk on Ukraine, Boris Johnson, I actually think Boris Johnson will have read Mackinder. I actually think he will be known of this, even though he comes across as a buffoon. He's very sort of highly educated. But the problem with the kind of pop social media politics is that everything is in the here and now, and grand strategy seems almost ridiculous and absurd. And this is how Trump comes across to like normal everyday liberals and the masses when he talks like this. But there's definitely a logic behind it.
I mean, just one thing to refer to. You said implicitly the idea of America as sugar daddy, just to reinforce that. Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands and current Secretary General of NATO, in the last NATO conference,
Yes.
literally called Trump daddy.
Literally. That's pathetic. That's absolutely pathetic.
Many such cases.
Well, I mean, one thing that Putin and Xi Jinping of China have an advantage of where Trump does not is that Trump is ultimately bound by term limits. So he can't force a posture within America to the extent that Putin can, who has basically been in charge of Russia since 1999, even though we had the Medvedev blip from 2008 up until 2012. So even if he were to inject a bit of Mackinder-esque, realpolitik in this, in some cases there is definite continuity in the US State Department, but if Trump tries to generally innovate, it will just appear like schizophrenia, which I think is the common assumption that we have among so much of Trump's policies, especially if you look at his posts during the quote-unquote 12 days war. And as for strategic thinking among European leaders, I mean, it's not even to say there isn't any. I think it would be assumed that there is a chasm, there is a void, there is antimatter where there should be strategic thinking regarding Europe. So it's almost a nonsense to even trying to engage with it on that level. All right, there's a last point I wanted to bring up, which is so much of Mackinder. There are two points I wanted to bring up just quickly. I started this talk by talking about Mackinder viewing this as the end of the Columbian epoch. Well, ironically, what you've been mentioning, Semyagog, regarding the expansion up into the Arctic, actually would conflict with that and reinforce it, strangely enough. It would conflict with it in the sense that what Mackinder assumed to be a world system, whereby he could predict the geographic pivot coming from Russia, is actually being turned on its head by the fact that no, there are still areas to explore due to changes in climate and innovations in technology. Yet it would also reinforce his original point, the centrality of Eurasia, due to what we consider to be the accessibility and the interconnectivity of the world island. Just one point. But the final point I want to make is regarding this whole notion of historical determinism derived from geography. Obviously, I've talked about so much history where I do not believe that is the case at all. You can look at civilizations which have terrible geographic positions who are able to excel given their meager resources, and then countries with abundance that ultimately end up doing nothing. I guess the last thing I really want to sort of unpack here is how viable really is geographic determinism as a mechanism. I mean, we can look all the way back to figures like Leibniz,